There's no doubt 2026 is shaping up to be a complicated year for investors. So I thought it'd be interesting to answer a simple question. What investments are investors actually backing the most going into the year ahead? Through Nvidia, I get to see aggregated data across thousands of real investor portfolios. And what shows up there is something most people don't expect. That if you don't make very deliberate choices, you end up with almost the same portfolio as everyone else. So today I'm going to show you the 5 most held investments by Australian investors going into 2026. And what those choices reveal about how people actually invest. Now, this video isn't a list of good investments or bad ones. It's simply a snapshot of where sensible popular choices tend to lead when they stack up over time. The top 5 rankings are based off aggregated Australian investor portfolios tracked on Nvidia. So this is thousands of real investor portfolios with simply looking at the behavior of these, not any opinions. Let's get into it. Number 5 is VGS, which is the Vanguard International Shares Index ETF. And typically investors add this for global exposure. It's got international shares in the name after all. And this ETF feels diversified. It feels like you're buying a little piece of all around the world. But interestingly, returns are dominated by US companies, particularly the Mag 7 or the Magnificent 7. So if you go to the Vanguard website and look at the top 10 holdings of VGS, you'll see that all US companies. And if you go down to weighting by region, you see it's weighted by something like 70 to 80% to the US markets. And that's something to be aware of when you're looking for that global diversification, because this might be labeled international, but it's driven by the same US companies that you see in other ETFs. Number 4 is BHP, or BHP Group Limited. Now, this is one of the world's largest mining companies, and it produces things like iron ore, copper, coal, other raw materials used in all sorts of manufacturing processes. And it's often the first individual stock people buy on the ASX. And this is often because it has a strong dividend history and franking credits. And if you know any Australian investors, you'll know that Aussie investors love a good dividend paying stock with franking credits especially. And franking credits are kind of a unique feature of investing here in Australia that give you tax credits that can be beneficial. BHP is typically held in these portfolios for decades. It's one of those stocks you see people inherit from their parents and their grandparents, and it gets passed down through these portfolios, and investors often end up with a BHP holding, part of the wallpaper of their portfolio. The issue with it is because it has been a good performer for such a long time, it barely gets reviewed when you're looking at the portfolio composition, and over time it can form such a weight inside your portfolio that it actually is holding a big unrealized gain. Now, typically that's not a bad thing because it means it's performed well, but it becomes a bad thing if it becomes such a large weight in your portfolio and then due to some external event, you're forced to take action. So if you have to rebalance, or you need to buy a house or buy a car, or some event forces you to sell, you can end up with quite a large tax bill that you weren't expecting. So keep that in mind when you're holding your BHP holding, or any holding kind of like it. But BHP is typically not a conviction pick. I don't meet many people who are really passionate about it. It seems to be more of a comfort pick, or one that people have inherited and just hold on to. Number 3 is NDQ. So this is the BetaShares Nasdaq 100 ETF. And typically investors add this to their portfolio for tech exposure. So a lot of the big tech companies list on the Nasdaq in the US. Buying into the Nasdaq 100 gives you pretty good exposure to all the big tech companies, your Apples, your Teslas, your Googles, your Nvidias, and that kind of thing. It's also had quite strong recent performance, so it's up roughly 100% or so over the last 5 years. So that's attracted a lot of investors to it. And typically people who want to keep up with tech and innovation seem to buy this Nasdaq 100 ETF. However, there's part of it I want to discuss. And because of this index is a market cap weighted index, it means the ranking is done by market cap. So what you'll find is the top few companies, the top 7 for example, are the Magnificent 7. So your Apple, your Tesla, your Google, your Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, I think I've covered them all. They're the ones driving this index. So even though you've bought into 100 companies listed on the Nasdaq, most of the action happens from those top companies. And interestingly enough, those are the same top companies in the top 10 of VGS, which we discussed earlier. Because it's market cap weighted, it means as money flows into that ETF, the majority of that cash flows into those top companies, which increases concentration even more. So when you're buying into one of these index trackers, you've got to keep in mind that there is concentration, and this usually happens across every index. Number 2, IVV, or the iShares S&P 500 ETF. Now this ETF is super common, that's why it's number 2, and it gives people default US exposure. So when you want to bet on the US market, which a lot of people do, it's the biggest and baddest market out there that you can possibly invest in, people typically go for IVV, which is how it's number 2. And this is treated as a core holding in investors' portfolios. So the portfolios that we look at, of which there's tens of thousands in Nvidia, the ones that are holding IVV are typically holding it as a central cornerstone of the portfolio. So in recent years, as the core and satellite approach has been popularized even more, IVV sits as one of the core holdings inside a portfolio. But like we've been discussing with VGS and NDQ, it may come as a surprise, or not, that the top holdings in IVV are also the Magnificent Seven. So the same top holdings as VGS and the same top holdings as NDQ. The same problem happens is because it's market cap weighted, a lot of the capital flowing into IVV then flows through to those top companies, which is driving a lot of concentration. And I also see a lot of investors hold IVV alongside NDQ and alongside VGS, and they end up highly concentrating their investment capital into that tech sector, into that US tech sector, and not really aware that that's what they're doing. So even though these 3 are all different ETFs, largely they currently have the same drivers sitting underneath. Number 1 is VAS, or the Vanguard Australian Shares Index, or the ASX 300, which is what it is underneath. Now, it should be to no surprise that this is in people's investment portfolios. I think this was actually the first ETF I ever purchased myself as well. It's a really common one because it has this strong home bias anchor to it. So Australian investors typically only invest in Australian companies. And if they branch out from there, they might invest in the US. And that's where it usually stops. But that's why VAS is number 1. In Australia, there's this really strong culture around dividends. And a lot of Australian companies pay dividends with franking credits, which investors typically really like because it gives a lot of tax benefits. And VAS is an ETF that has quite a good dividend return in comparison to some of the other ETFs we've talked about, like IVV. IVV usually has a stronger capital gain, but VAS often has a stronger income return component. One of the things I think investors need to be aware of with these kind of ETFs is they'll be getting dividends, they might turn on DRP to reinvest into that position, but over time the position becomes quite a big weighting in the portfolio. And like we discussed earlier, as that weighting increases, it can put you into a tricky position when it comes time to act. So it's something to be aware of as your position grows in VAS. The other thing to think about with VAS is it's thankfully not dominated by the Magnificent Seven, because none of them are listed on the ASX. However, it is dominated by what's in the ASX 10. And a lot of people have never looked at this, but the top 10 companies in the ASX are from 2 things: mining stocks and banking stocks. So when you invest into VAS, 45% of the index, I believe, is those top 10. And then the other 55% is made up of the remaining 290 companies. So when you're buying VAS, you're really putting your money, a huge majority of your money, into banks and mining stocks. Now that's quite interesting because a lot of investors I speak to aren't actually aware they've heavily invested into banks and mining stocks. And I don't actually know many people who are that passionate about the banks here in Australia or about mining companies here in Australia. So it's important to know, if you're invested in these things, what you're actually invested in, so that you can make moves relative to what's happening in the market. If something's happening in the mining sector you don't like, you should know that you're exposed to it. VAS is typically not like a conviction decision that, oh, I'm really into the VAS. It's more of a good starting point, and it forms people's core holding in their portfolio. So we talked about earlier with IVV and the core and satellite approach. VAS is another one of those cornerstone holdings, which is why it's number 1 out of all the portfolios in Nvidia. So those top 5 are your typical default Australian portfolio. So not good, not bad, not reckless, just a bunch of familiar holdings in there. But the one thing that I hope became evident was that while there's a lot of different ticker symbols there with the different ETFs, a lot of it have the same drivers underneath. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something you need to be aware of. So the defaults like these top 5 aren't necessarily dangerous, but they're usually not intentional. And if you don't know what you've defaulted into, then it's hard to know if it fits your goals and investment thesis. So if you don't want to be invested in the US tech companies, maybe you shouldn't be heavily invested into IVV, NDQ, and VGS. And I see a lot of overlap between those three in a lot of investor portfolios. But then on the other hand, maybe you are all about the US tech sector. And in that case, maybe you do want to invest in those things. Again, the point is just make sure you know what you're investing in. Now, this is why I built Navexa in the first place, to see all this data laid bare so you can invest knowing exactly what you're holding and what you're doing. If you're interested in trying that, check out the link in the description, free 2-week trial, give it a go. But overall, the goal isn't to avoid popular investments. It's just to make sure that the portfolio you have is one you have chosen and not simply one that you've just drifted into. If you like this stuff, check out our next video. See you in the next one.